Yes, my heart breaks to pieces. This is how we are whole. Uncovering the memory in this place I call home. Whoa, oh, oh, whoa. Whoa, oh, oh, whoa.
Welcome to Abolition Now. We're going to start with some audio. This is Martin Luther King Jr. on power and love. We'll start in just a bit.
The plantation and the ghetto were created by those who had power both to confine those who had no power and to perpetuate their powerlessness. Now, the problem of transforming the ghetto, therefore, is a problem of power. A confrontation between the forces of power demanding change and the forces of power dedicated to the preserving of the status quo. Now, power properly understood is nothing but the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. Power is the ability of a labor union like UAW to make the most powerful corporation in the world, General Motors, say yes when it wants to say no. That's power. There is nothing wrong with power if power is used correctly. You see, what happened is that some of our philosophers got off base. And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites. So that love is identified with a resignation of power and power with a denial of love. It was this misinterpretation that caused the philosopher Nietzsche to reject the Christian concept of love. It was the same misinterpretation which induced Christian theologians to reject Nietzsche's philosophy of the will to power in the name of the Christian idea of love. Now, we got to get this thing right. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best. Power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love.
There's gonna be good times, good times. There's gonna be good times, good times. I know there's gonna be.
Live from Otter Media, you're listening to Abolition Now, the show where dismantling the cis-heteropatriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist, settler colonial state is a policy issue that just can't wait.
I know there's gonna be good times, good times, good times. There's gonna be good times,
Abolition Now is a production of ADLC, a radical leftist alliance of students here on campus. Our mission is to enact visions of abolitionist and decolonial learning at CSUMB. My name is Dana, and I'll be your host for today's show. Joining me in the studio is Megan Matthews, a fourth-year psychology major who has played an essential role in making ADLC the communally and ecologically oriented collective that it is today. When I first met Megan earlier this year, I was amazed not only by her profound analysis of social issues, but also by her visionary mind for social change. That's why I'm so excited to have her as a guest for today's show, where we'll truly be diving into the political vision of prison-industrial complex abolition. What would it look like to build community power that not only countervails that of the state, but renders it obsolete? And what would it look like for justice not be punitive, as we're used to, but transformative? All that and more coming up on Abolition Now. Stay tuned.
Come on,
Welcome back to Abolition Now, where we first cover critical perspectives and histories that it's urgent for you to know about, and second, we provide the theoretical framework to connect the issues we talk about to a larger, actionable, and ongoing project of global emancipation. Today on the show, community empowerment and transformative justice. So, as abolitionists, we often get this question that it's often the first question that people ask us, and that's, but how would that work, right? How would we be able to keep people safe without police? How would we be able to get justice for people who have been victimized without the court system, without judges and juries and prisons? And the first way we can go about answering this question is to point out the tenuousness of the assumptions that are baked into the questions themselves, right? That the police actually do keep us safe, that the court system actually does get justice for people who have been victimized. So these are dubious, and the legitimacy of these institutions rests on people assuming dogmatically that these things are true, regardless of how much the empirical reality of the situation and the historical precedent contradicts them. So I've invited Megan here, visionary of ADLC, to talk about the abolitionist vision of community empowerment and transformative justice. However, we do need to start by kind of saying, why do we even need a radical alternative in the first place? Like, what is so bad about the current system that calls for not just reform, we aren't satisfied with just reform, but a radical rethinking of how we do community safety and how we do justice?
I think throughout history we kind of have this assumption that the prison industrial complex as well as police are there to protect us, even though in reality the core reason why we created those things in the first place has been to control individuals, more specifically poor people of color, I suppose. And in reality, we've seen countless times that actually the court system as well as policing really does not serve to protect our community, only to criminalize us and to have a certain ideology of who is determined to be allowed to live comfortably. And it is very important for us to completely change the way that our system is currently in place, because we should just have a more positive view of each other and have a more connected community that doesn't rely on these very strict and patriarchal systems of power. And I think we should invest in our community to go about seeing the real core of why people behave in certain ways and why harm is caused, instead of just kind of like throwing people in cages to think that that's a form of protection, when really it's just something that occurs after the fact, but it doesn't really it doesn't change how much harm is in our society.
Yeah, so pulling out a couple really good points that you made there, we do not see the purpose of these institutions as public safety or as creating a juster and fairer society. Those are the ideological purposes of those institutions, but if you look through history, right, as Megan said, we see these are instruments of social control. These are ways of making sure that workers cannot organize, that people cannot change the material conditions that they're subjected to. Think about any protest in history that has tried to advance civil rights, that has tried to advance the rights for workers, rights for any kind of group that is oppressed in society. And what group of people shows up to the protest to make sure that nothing actually that gets done and to try and brutally suppress those protests? It's the goddamn police, right? How do we actually deal with people having counter-hegemonic ideals and beliefs in this society? We criminalize dissent, right? And through institutions like the CIA and the FBI, hunt down, infiltrate, sow dissent, and try and essentially break up any kind of movement that could push for revolutionary change. It has always been the police and the criminal justice system that has been the tool of the state in making sure that the status quo remains the way that it is. Yeah. Right? So these are instruments of social control. They are not here to help you. And this whole ideology that they are in place to help you goes way back to colonial history. It goes back to history of slavery, because the first police forces emerged as ways for, the colonial power to maintain control over the population, because the military was off doing colonialism abroad, overseas, right? So in Britain, right, in the 1830s, Britain was out colonizing the world, but then they had also the Irish who they were trying to colonize, and they needed a locally available uniformed force that could put down the Irish uprisings to make sure that they could keep doing colonialism on their own soil in addition to abroad. This was the origin of the first uniformed, professionalized police force, and this is where we get discourse about police being peacekeepers, police being professionals, police only going after the bad guys. And if you haven't done anything wrong, you shouldn't have anything to hide. This is where we get the beginning of all this discourse that legitimizes the force of the police by forcing us to think that they are on our side. So it's, in other words, a way of instigating martial law without having the appearance of martial law. And we see that continued in the way that police forces in the United States, as they developed, copied directly from the first police forces that emerged in Britain. In the southern United States, of course, it's even more direct, because it's the slave patrols that would literally go around trying to hunt down and return runaway slaves. Then, once slavery ended, once the Emancipation Proclamation, although slavery we know did not really ended after the Emancipation Proclamation, it just continued in new forms. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, the slave patrols in the South were not disbanded. They were simply given new names, and the new name that they got was police.
I feel like it's also good to point out just the reputation that the police have had in the way that they tend to go after, people of color, and they're overly violent. And there's also just this overall in the police, there's this reputation of being sort of like a frat organization that's kind of has this culture of racism that is very much connected back to slavery. And I think it's very important to recognize what our laws are and what we criminalize. A lot of the times it is, just nonviolent drug offenses, arresting people for loitering or just being there,
being poor, being unproperty.
So they try to criminalize that, because one, then you can fund private prisons, and it becomes a for-profit institution as well as using their labor for profit. So I think it's important to note how much of our laws are pretty much unnecessary. Why are we criminalizing people for just doing drugs, having a drug addiction? Why are we throwing them in a cell instead of giving them the help they need for their addiction, and not criminalizing that and making them into a bad person? And all the other behaviors that are in place should not be criminalized, because that does not change behavior. If anything, a lot of the times people that go to prison, they reoffend after going to prison, and sometimes they even learn different ways to offend in prison. So it doesn't serve to change behavior or improve the life of the people that are doing these things, to stop them from doing it, but it only serves to criminalize them and kind of feed into this revenge fantasy that the public wants from a lot of prisons and the court system.
Yeah, pulling out a couple points there that, when neoliberal policies are implemented, neoliberal meaning that what was formerly under the control of the government is privatized off into, or what was formerly publicly owned resources, right, and things that the community could do to help itself and to provide for itself, or resources they could freely access, are put into private hands. Then there's a big paywall that's slapped over them, and then whoever can't afford that shit, just fuck you and die. That's essentially what neoliberalism is that extreme individualism to the point of everyone is kind of seen as you're on your own, right? And if you can't make it on your own, then fuck you and die, is essentially what they're saying, right? So when neoliberal policies are implemented, the result is that it generates a large underclass of dispossessed and likely to be criminalized workers. Now, when neoliberal policies are implemented, repression must increase in turn, right? Read David Harvey. neoliberalism is all about small government until it comes to the punitive apparatuses that ensure that the population can be surveilled, policed, and punished adequately for falling out of line, right, with the disciplinary society that has been created. And so as government gets smaller, and government in terms of public control over resources gets smaller, government control over punishment and punitive apparatuses increases. Because if you have a whole bunch of dispossessed and unhappy people, and they're free to do whatever they want, right, then they can get together and try and change things. But if they are all thrown in cages, right, then that is a way of dealing with mass social discontentment, and it is also a way of driving a wedge between the working class by saying, hey, the brown people or the immigrants, right, or the scary, groomers, right, as the new one, right, find some sort of marginalized identity and then point at that and say that's the problem, not the fact that your labor is being exploited and that you're being pitted against each other and forced not to collaborate with each other because you're all in competition for the scarce wages while the capital and landowning class walks away with billions and billions of dollars. So, moving into, like what Megan was saying, the difference between crime and harm. Like Megan was saying, like, why is it that when we see someone with a drug addiction, the response is throw them in a cage? Yeah, that'll fucking work. Like, if the goal of the justice system is to create a better society, if we have a consequentialist ethic of saying whatever we do, we definitely want tomorrow to be a better day than today, then look at the outcomes, right, of any of the behaviors that we've currently criminalized. Drug addiction, poverty and homelessness, border crossings, sex work, right? There are larger social issues that are connected to each of these individual behaviors that make them associated with poverty, right, and destruction and harm, right? There is social harm there, but criminalizing the behavior itself, the behavior of crossing over a border itself, the behavior of possessing a drug itself, the behavior of paying and receiving money for sex in and of itself. Criminalizing those acts end up punishing the people who are suffering the most of the social issues that are supposedly trying to be solved by the fact that we've criminalized these things. Mm-hmm. So I'd like Megan to kind of talk a little bit more about the connection between criminalization and the way that we criminalize behaviors and what we were talking about in the pre-show about this mirroring the model of a patriarchal household where the husband or the father, right, keeps the woman and keeps the children in line.
I think we've noticed just that a lot of the structures in place are similar to that of a strict household, with punishment being the main leader. It's the main structure of how to change behavior in the household. So it's very similar to the way that our society is built. It's very much on this concept of if you do something wrong, you get punished. And it doesn't go into the core of why someone does something and how to stop them from doing that. A lot of the time, most negative behaviors are from a place of ignorance or a place of need, like trying to get a need met that you didn't know how to do, so you do it in a way that is considered incorrect. So by going through this behavior, they are punished for that, but they don't know why. So it's just kind of this concept of you get punished for doing something, but you aren't given the necessary resources to improve yourself. So it's just people are like tortured, just thrown into prisons, which they are not given the necessary resources to survive well. They are not given good food. They are not given enough clothing to last a week, and it's just unnecessary. And I don't know what the justification would be for not providing people for what they need, other than just to punish them, right? Further that punishment in prisons, instead of provide a space to actually understand where this person's coming from, why they did harm, and how to change it. So if our ultimate goal is to change behavior, then that should be our goal, not to punish people and kind of give in to this animalistic feeling of revenge that a lot of us have. And that's why our idea of justice is like, we consider someone going to jail for committing a crime that we find outrageous to be a sign of justice or a sign of change in our society. We think, oh, look, this guy we finally got justice for the victim, even though, one, it is very hard for especially people that have done like physical harm to others. It is hard for them to get true accountability. So whenever one person goes to jail for it, then we're finally like, yes, finally. But I don't think that's the world we really want, especially if that's not going to change that behavior and improve our society as a whole.
Yeah, and the reason why I think there's such a clear parallel to the patriarchal model of the home is because think about when your parents would tell you to do something and then you would ask them why, and they would say, because I said so. Mm-hmm. Right? And then if you didn't do it, they would punish you. And what did that, well, okay, I'm just speaking from my personal experience, but what that taught me was avoid punishment.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't
obey.
That did not, it did not teach me to do the right thing or teach me why whatever they didn't want me to do was wrong. Mm-hmm. It taught me, okay, if I do this and get caught, I will get punished. Mm-hmm. So it inspired me to find increasingly innovative ways of not getting caught, and taught me nothing about the actual ethics or morals involved of like my actions, or thinking about, what effect my actions were having on others, right? Mm-hmm. And this is exactly the model that we use in our current system. It doesn't really matter what someone does if they're, assaulting someone or if they're smoking marijuana. You broke the law. You disobeyed the arbitrary will of the state, and now you will be punished for it.
And we already understand that a strict parent does not stop a child's behavior. It only makes them sneakier. So really, we understand that in a larger society too, because we know that law doesn't stop crime. It just makes people smarter about getting away with it, which makes it worse. It makes our society less safe because now there's things going on that we can't always detect because people are getting really good at hiding it. And as well, it doesn't stop the behavior. No one understands why they're doing something, why something's bad, and so then they just keep doing it. And like I said before, a lot of the time people are doing crimes, especially like theft and loitering or whatever, is because they don't have the necessary resources that they need to survive in a positive way.
Yeah. And the other thing about that is that it not just incentivizes people to work harder to get around the rules as opposed to actually follow whatever rules you want them to follow. It also means that people who have more wealth and resources are going to get away with the same crimes if they were done by someone who was doing them out of necessity, doing them because they're in poverty, out of desperation, right? They're not going to have the time and the resources to plan how to get away with it effectively, right? So what does this lead to? This leads to a situation like Jeffrey Epstein getting away with what he did for so long, right? But then you also look at sentencing disparities, and it's exactly what you would expect in a settler colonial racial capitalist society, where the same crimes committed, depending on what race you are, depending on what socioeconomic status you are, your punishment is literally going to be different depending on that, even if you do the exact same crime, right? So that's another reason why I think it's great to have Megan on this show, is because she's a psych major and can tell us exactly what effect this has when you have an inconsistent level of punishment for the same act.
Yeah, it's really important. We learn that in main subject about punishment and reinforcement. A lot of the times we find that reinforcement actually doesn't have to be as consistent in order for change to happen in a behavior. It's actually people are more likely to change their behavior if they know good things that they're going to get good things from doing that behavior. However, punishment has to be consistent in order for change to happen. As well, I feel like punishment just serves to fear that person in power, whether that be a parent or a leader. It just goes to fear that consequence. It doesn't go to really systematically change the way that we view that behavior and to consider the feelings and actions of other people. And if we do something wrong and we understand why we did it wrong, like, oh wow, I didn't understand that, now I do, and then we go to fully understand that, and it is much better. It fosters a better sense of understanding and kindness to one another. I feel like with the way that society is now, it just goes to, it adds a lot of shame to mistakes. When someone makes a mistake and they do something wrong, it just fosters this feeling of like shame, of like, now you are like banished from society because you did this drug, or you whatever, even as far as like you physically hurt someone and that was a mistake, but instead of having a feeling of understanding and to a sense of accountability so that this person can change their behavior, it's just goes straight to push them out of society.
Yeah, so we're getting close to the halfway mark, so I'll just sum up a little bit, because I think you've made some great points here, that we're not just like bleeding heart pinkos, right, that think everyone should just be able to do whatever they want. There's a lot, when we say that not all crime is harm, we also mean that not all harm is crime, that there's a lot of sources of harm and a lot of harm that is done in our society that just goes completely unpunished or goes completely without accountability because we do not see, it does not rise to the level of a crime, right? So if your professor, right, has ever said something misogynistic in class, like what, unless they're like literally sexually assaulting you or like sexually harassing you, like what recourse really do you have for that? Like there's no system of accountability for that. Like they can just do that and you can like complain about it, right? But like good luck, right? Get in this institution, fucking good luck. And so there's all this like harm that happens on a day-to-day basis that like literally we have no system to even address. So it's not necessarily that we say like, oh yeah, like all the people in jail did nothing wrong. Like obviously that's not what we're saying. We're saying that like the way that we are addressing harm is unproductive, and that we're addressing behaviors that are not harmful as harm. And then thirdly, that like there's a bunch of sources of harm that we have no way of addressing because our current system of justice is not set up to view those things as legitimate forms of harm, right? Like the harm that like a bank does to someone, right, when they like repossess their home, or you know, like there's all these sorts of harm that are totally normalized, and they're built into the way that a capitalist economy works, and they're legitimized by a code of law, and so we aren't even allowed to see them as harm, right? Your employer exploiting you is totally legal. They're allowed to pay you less than what your labor is worth. In fact, the law protects their ability to do that, right? So, so wrapping it up, I guess, before we get to our midway break, to summarize, we see there is several different models of justice, and we could get philosophical about what it even means to do justice, to carry out justice, to have justice. Why do we demand justice? Why do we have a seemingly innate desire for justice and for fairness in society? But it comes down to your philosophy of what you see as justice also, that will influence like what you see as, you know, an appropriate response to social harm. However, we can still take a consequentialist approach to all of those models and say like, what outcomes does this lead to? Like if you're saying, well, we deserve, you know, people who kill people deserve also to die, then you can also ask, okay, would you like more people to die? Because the death penalty actually does not lead to lower murder rates. So do you want more innocent people to die, or do you just want there to be the same number of murderers and we just keep killing the murderers? Like what is it, you know, you can inquire consequentially into all of the different models, right? But that's the model that we currently have, is the retributive or punitive model, where you did something bad, an eye for an eye, I'm gonna fuck you up because you fucked someone else up, right? In theory, that's how our current system of justice is supposed to work. Now I invited Megan on to talk about transformative justice, which is, as we've kind of been building towards in these discussions, a radical rethinking of what even makes justice, right? So instead of seeing it as an individual incident of harm, where we only need to consider the individual who did the harm, the individual who was harmed, and then rectify that situation. Instead, we look at the social conditions and the social relationships that enabled that harm to happen in the first place. So if someone assaults someone, we also would ask questions like, why do we have a culture that enables that sort of violence? Why were the conditions that that person was in not allow them to feel loved and supported to the extent that they feel value for their fellow human, right? Like, we would have to start asking these deeper questions about, like, what kind of society are we living in, and how do we all contribute to the conditions that allow crime to happen, that allow harm to happen. We'd have to see it as a social responsibility instead of as an individual responsibility, and that means something radically different than what we have now. So could you talk, just last thing before we go to the break, about what transformative justice is at its core and how it's different from our current system?
So essentially, transformative justice would be a complete abolition of the prison industrial complex as well as police, and we would focus more of our resources, money, and time onto community development and making sure that the people in our community get their needs met. That way that a lot of these, what we consider crimes would hopefully decrease because of the fact that everyone will have their needs met. So they're less likely to need to steal or do any of the other things that we consider to be harmful to our society. And so that would be the kind of, more community-based solutions other than a sort of, punishment-based situation. So instead, when people do harm, we would focus on the reasons behind why they did harm and how to actually change the systems in place that allow harm like that to happen in the first place. So that would be different from our current system, because our current system relies a lot on punishment, prisons, and all other types of these sorts of what we consider accountability. That is the way that we go about what we go about reducing harm. Instead, we would actually provide the necessary resources to stop negative behavior in the first place, instead of just punishing people that do bad things, because that does not make our society safer.
Yeah, and most notably, this is a shift of power from the state to the community, to the hands of the community members themselves,
And the
victims of the crimes, right? And also seeing the offenders, right, in these situations as members of the community, right, who have relationships to the community that are responsible for what they did. So it's a shift of power, and we're going to talk when we come back from the break about what it would look like to build this type of community power. But it's important to know that transformative justice is not just like a utopian ideal. We don't need to wait for the overthrow of the state in order to do it. Since it's community level and since it's by definition grassroots, this is something that we can build outside the state before ever actually having to change anything about the state itself, right? It's something that can be organic and self-defined. And most TJ programs are started by community members themselves, those directly impacted by interpersonal violence, police violence, and incarceration, right? Because they are often the most knowledgeable about the actual issues that our current criminal justice system creates, and that an alternate would need to provide solutions to. So when we're talking about like imagining or envisioning how we could keep each other safe and carry out justice without police and prisons, we forget that for a lot of people, calling the police is already not an option, right? A lot of students on our own campus do not feel comfortable calling UPD in a crisis. So here on this campus, we too are already in need of alternatives to be built from the ground up, starting now, before the state or before the institution will ever think to budge on it, right? So we'll talk more about what it would mean or what it would look like to build that power. We're going to dive into the praxis side of the conversation when we come back from the break. So far, we've established at the very least that we need a radical alternative to the current system, and that we know that this is possible. So next we'll address the question of what exactly we need to do, how we'll do it, and what really stands in our way. So that's all coming up. We'll be talking about power. But first we're going to take a short break. We're going to stay hydrated, but stay tuned. We'll be back shortly. This is Abolition Now.
Be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials, because the revolution will not be televised. revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not show you pictures of Nixon blowing a bugle and leading a charge by John Mitchell, General Abrams, and Spyro Agnew to eat hog maws confiscated from a Harlem sanctuary. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by the Schaefer Award Theater and will not star Natalie Woods and Steve McQueen or Bullwinkle and Julia. The revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution will not get rid of the nub. The revolution will not make you look 5 pounds thinner because the revolution will not be televised, brother. There will be no pictures of you and Willie Mae pushing that shopping cart down the block on the dead run or trying to slide that color TV into a stolen ambulance. NBC will not be able to predict the winner at 8:32 on report from 29 districts. The revolution will not be televised. There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers on the instant replay. There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers on the instant replay. There will be no pictures of Whitney Young being run out of Harlem on a rail with a brand new process. There will be no slow motion or still life of Roy Wilkins strolling through Watts in a red, black, and green liberation jumpsuit that he has been saving for just the proper occasion. Green Acres, Beverly Hillbillies, and Hooterville Junction will no longer be so damn relevant, and women will not care if Dick finally got down with Jane on Search for Tomorrow, because black people will be in the street looking for a brighter day. The revolution will not be televised. There will be no highlights on the 11 o'clock news and no pictures of Harry armed women liberationists and Jackie Onassis blowing her nose. The theme song will not be written by Jim Webb or Francis Scott Key, nor sung by Glenn Campbell, Tom Jones, Johnny Cash, Engelbert Humperdinck, or The Rare Earth. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be right back after a message about a white tornado, white lightning, or white people. You will not have to worry about a dove in your bedroom, the tiger in your tank, or the giant in your toilet bowl. The revolution will not go better with Coke. The revolution will not fight germs that may cause bad breath. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.
Welcome back to Abolition Now. This program is a project of the Abolitionist and Decolonial Learning Collective, an alliance of students here on campus who are committed to the abolition of all forms of state violence and the liberation of all colonized people. Today on the show, we're honored to have as our guest ADLC's foremost abolitionist visionary, Megan Matthews. And in the first half of the program, we talked about transformative justice and also our current model of justice and why we need an alternative for addressing social harm in a way that upholds the basic human dignity of all, not just as subjects of the state, but also as subjects of a community and as agents in the community. And we also need a model that works towards a fairer and juster society overall by refusing to see incidents of harm as isolated individual aberrations, but rather as downstream effects of larger structures and patterns of harmful social conditions and social relations, which, if the goal of the system of justice is truly justice and fairness, those larger structures of harm certainly merit a response just as much as do the individual manifestations as incidents of interpersonal harm. So transformative justice proposes not only a radical redefinition of what counts as harm and injustice, but also a shift of the power to define injustice and act to address it out of the hands of the state and into the hands of the community. This shift of power that we're talking about is nothing short of revolutionary. But as Gil Scott-Heron said in the interlude music, the revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts with commercial interruptions. In other words, the state will not willingly cede this power. Luckily, we subscribe to a practice that doesn't need to wait around for something that will not happen. So one point that we've been building to in the first half of the show is that an empowered community countervails state power by rendering the functions of the state obsolete. And while that sounds like a daunting task, right, rendering the state obsolete, we can actually see that we have the capacity for social cohesion in the social groups that we already form. And we would just want this level of social cohesion at a larger community level. these groups, and whether we recognize it or not, already satisfy some of the functions that we would want the state to serve, and often some of the functions that the state currently neglects. So for example, like when a coworker, it needs a surgery that they can't afford, the coworkers will start a GoFundMe and they'll raise money so that the person can afford the surgery or the treatment that they need, right? And that's fulfilling the role of a state that does not provide universal health care, right? If you have an elderly neighbor, a lot of times neighbors in a building will rotate check-ins and drop off food for them and make sure that they're okay, right? And, have this sort of support system that is doing the role of the state when the state doesn't provide adequate social services for the elderly and the poor. Even if you're just like a group of punks, like squatting in an abandoned building and you're taking turns as lookout, you are fulfilling the role of a state that criminalizes unpropertied existence, right? So there's all these examples of self-governance really happening already, that we do already. And they kind of sound just like feel-good charity stories, but that's just the point, that self-governance, or meeting the immediate needs of the community through collective action, is not only liberatory, it also feels good. Compare this to the experience of like paying taxes or applying for welfare or applying for food stamps, right? And it's downright joyous. In all of these examples, at their core, serve the same function of the collection of taxes and the dispersion of benefits that the state would do, right? Everyone only needs to contribute a little for the people most in need to benefit a lot, right? So my next question that I'd like to pose to Megan is, thinking about building community power is something that would need this sort of social cohesion that we already see on a small scale, but how would we scale this up to the level of larger communities?
I feel like it just would be the same kind of smaller interactions, but with just kind of more people involved. I feel like it would go back to a similar structure that indigenous peoples had, and how they focus more on their individual communities. And I would think that we wouldn't have as many larger powers like the federal government or even state governments. It would be a focus on the individual communities and what they specifically want to address harm. We would of course, we wouldn't have the punishment the way that we see it, but
I think another thing that concerns me, and definitely something that I've been thinking about a lot recently in terms of how we would scale up this kind of vision of communal self-governance that is very realistic. You can very realistically visualize that on a small scale, but when you're asked to imagine that like a whole city or a whole state or a whole nation could do this, eventually sometimes it's hard to see that because the world that we live in is so different from that it's almost unimaginable to think that we could have that level of social cohesion on a larger level when we're so divided into our little groups, right, with our own interests and goals, and then pitted against each other as part of the ideology that allows things to continue and keeps us from organizing collectively, is for us to see ourselves as individuals or as members of our little groups, more than having solidarity across the larger like working class.
I think it's tough because, especially the way that we see our communities now, we're so used to having like a leader kind of figure that kind of tells us what to do and have the structures that have been in place for so long. So to imagine a world that doesn't have that is kind of hard to imagine. And I think it's important to note that the ideas of transformative justice are still kind of experimental in the fact that we don't have all the answers. Mm-hmm. We're just trying to find a different way to go about it that is better, because we know for a fact that the way that our systems are going now are not benefiting our community. So instead, ideally in the future, we would be able to connect with each other on a deeper basis, even in our day-to-day life, in a way that makes us really care about each other, because I think currently it is really easy for us to be apathetic towards other people's hardships, and for us to be like, oh well, it's not my problem because I don't know them, or I've never been in that situation, so I don't really care. And it's really easy with our individualistic mindset to have that and to not really care about each other. But if you find, even in small communities, like for example, like maybe a city community where everyone kind of passes by each other all the time, so we kind of know each other, it just feels like there's more of this care for each other. And if we are all know each other on a deeper level and we really care about each other, we are much more likely to help each other, as opposed to the way that we are now, is we just view everyone else as strangers.
Yeah, I really want to go back to what you said. I think it was a great point about we don't have all the answers, and that doesn't mean that it's not a legitimate position to have, that we simply want something else than what we have now. Like, it's a pretty low bar to say, like, abolition could be something better than what we have now, seeing as how what we have now is so sucky for everyone, except, a small privileged minority of people, right? Like, I think I was reading I do a lot of research about abolition. I was reading a scholarly paper recently, which is full of jargon, so I hope that I don't get too jargony about this, but it called abolition a disepistemology, right? So epistemology meaning a way of knowing, right? Like, how do we know what we know? And dis meaning, like, we don't actually give a shit about that. Certainly it's good to, like, be able to verify, like where we're going and where we've been, right? But, like, not having all the answers immediately and not being able to know every single thing about what you're going to do is actually better, because it makes you more flexible to things that are changing and dynamic, which is certainly the situation in a community that ages and grows and changes over time. That, what a community is today is not going to be what the community is in 20 years or even in 20 days, right? Like, people change. People are always changing. They're getting older. Their ideas are changing. Their material conditions are changing. And so to say that we have all the answers and we know that this exact plan is going to work is very kind of authoritarian style of, like, thinking about, like, justice. That is one of the traps that I feel like our current system has fallen into, of, like, making it very rigid and static and not accounting for the fact that culture changes. Like, think about, like, how common it is for people to smoke pot now. It's still illegal on a federal level. Like, the laws just simply do not keep up with social change, of things becoming more socially acceptable, like homosexuality was a DSM mental illness until, like, what was it, like the 90s or the early 2000s?
Yeah, too recent.
Yeah, way too recent, right? So having, like, a group of experts, right, who are, the epistemological agents for the community, saying, like, we know what is going on and we are the experts and we're going to tell you what is best. We're trying to flip the script, really, and saying, like, no,
ask questions.
Ask questions, yeah.
Those communities that need the change, that are the ones that are most affected by these systems, we ask them, hey, what is happening in your communities and how do we help you? Instead of having these ideologies of, like, oh, we know best, we know what's better for everyone else, because we don't know yet. We're still figuring it out. And I know that's a kind of a scary thought to, kind of base your ideology off of. And as well, like, how do you go about changing your thought process about a society if, the people that are talking about it don't always know yet either. Yeah. But I think the point is, we're all going to figure it out together, and we have that sense of shared community in the fact that we know that the system that we currently have are not working, and they are only serving harm, and we want to work more together to help those people that actually need it.
Yeah, it's like that meme where, like, the Jesus is trying to talk to the people and they say most people rejected his message. They hated Jesus because he told them the truth. But, like, that's really the problem that we're identifying, right? That if you have this, like, really entrenched or, like, static or unchanging view of, like, what is and is not true, what is and is not objective fact, what is or is right and wrong, then, like, you're not going to, that's so brittle that it will break in the face of social change, which we know is happening all the time at every second of the day, right? People are changing, the world is changing, right? So being able to have some sort of flexibility, I feel like, is also a principle that we adopt. But seeing that we have only 10 minutes left of the show, I want to quick talk about the point of this second segment was going to be power, talking about building power. And I think this is, like, a way of looking at it, of saying, like, epistemic agency is power. Like, being able to be a legitimate source of knowledge and of truth is a source of power, right? And we've had this structure where it's handed down to us from teachers and professors and then from the official government narrative so long that, when that starts to not line up with people's material reality, they become very predisposed to a strongman, to an authoritarian leader who says, no, the dominant narrative is all fake, the vaccine is fake, COVID is fake, I have all the answers, and if you just do what I say, then everything will go away. Now, we understand that this is drawing on a certain discontentment that is very real, and that is something that is a real problem that our current system is not set up to face. However, it's very easy then for a demagogue to seize upon that discontentment and say, no, actually, it's the immigrants who are the problem, right? It's the gay people who are the problem, and if we just have more authoritarian control, more socially conservative, rigid gender roles, right, then everything will go back to the 1950s. Make America great again, right? So we certainly don't want that, but we also want to acknowledge that changing this, flipping the script and saying that we want the community to be the epistemic agent, right, to seize the power to be able to create their own knowledge, also is a form of saying people's lived experiences are a source of knowledge that is legitimate, right? So I think one of the stumbling blocks that maybe we can start to pick apart is that obviously community empowerment does not just mean the power to perform the functions that the state serves, right? But it also is the power to perform the functions that the state cannot, such as accounting for the power differentials between individuals, groups, and social entities. And the way that we're socially conditioned and socialized currently does not really allow for a critical perspective on the difference of power, the power differential between those entities. So in the face, this is my next question for you. In the face of deeply entrenched inequality, how do we ensure that an empowered community means community members are empowered equitably?
That's a tough one. I feel like a lot of it comes down to the people that we listen to in a lot of these movements, especially in, like we went back to before, asking them what they want. As well, I think a lot of it has to do with money and the resources that we are able to give to everyone. And I would say, I think it'd be tough to try to figure out how to disperse power equitably, because you can always say oh, we can all vote on everything, but that's a lot of work for every person to want to vote. And I think I don't know. But
another way of asking this question would be to say there are differentials of power across different communities as well, right? So at one of our recent events for ADLC, we had a person ask essentially that same question that we asked them for, how would that work? How would we possibly have a society where we could keep each other safe if we didn't have police? And our club advisor, Sarah, was there, and she said a really good point, which was that communities without police already exist. They're rich white communities, right, with well-funded schools, with well-funded public resources, and where people have an abundance of economic opportunities. The police don't go to these areas, right, because the community has what it needs already, right? And there isn't the need for this repression to take the place of an unmet social need, right? Now, that serves a good point, which is to say that the amount of police in an area is not what makes people safe, right? It's about what resources the community has. On the other hand, if you think about that for a couple seconds, you're wait a second, right? Although that's true, rich white communities are not the abolitionist vision of the future, obviously, right? Although they are an example of community safety coming from something other than police, that's not what we want, right? Because it's a safety that is built on a legacy of colonialism and slavery and racial capitalism. It's safety based on making other people unsafe so that they will work for slave wages so that they can be, exploited. So in past conversations I've had with you, Megan, I've been really, really amazed by your ability to draw parallels and achieve a unity of analysis between different scopes of analysis, right? Local, state, national, global, right? So in building community power to level state power, how do we not lose sight of leveling the power between communities and across communities nationally and globally? How do we reconcile the fact that what might empower one community is the same thing that would disempower another?
I think that's tough because I'm trying to think. I I think that just goes to show that each community needs to have a very specific type of power implemented in that certain community. I think it's tough to try to think about how we go about having a structure of power that doesn't harm a certain community. Mm-hmm. I think, I don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, I asked these questions because I was like, these are questions that I'm, bouncing around in my head. Yeah. And I think that, if I can do a shameless plug, these are the types of questions that, like, we as visionaries, not to toot our own horn, but as people who come to our club meetings, right, and engage in our club actions, because we don't have all the answers, but we know that together we have more answers than we do as individuals, and that is a model of learning that is not really the same as the type of learning, quote unquote learning, that you'll get in your classroom, where it's like the professor has the knowledge and all the students come and the professor puts the knowledge inside your brain, and then you walk away with knowledge, right? Like, no, we see that, like, everyone is bringing knowledge to that room, right? It's just that certain forms of knowledge are valued more than others, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we all get together in our club meetings, which you should come to at adlc.csumb on Instagram, follow us. At our club meetings, we have this philosophy of, like, we straight up come to each meeting from a place of unknowing, of saying, like, I straight up don't know. And we like asking just difficult questions and talking it over. So,
and I think that's kind of a hard thing for us in our society to kind of understand, because we're so used to learning being something that someone tells us something and then we encode that data into our brains. But I think the best kind of learning is ones where we learn from each other and we have a shared understanding and we ask questions and we really, engage with the material and we understand that, like, we don't have all the answers, and the whole point is to get everyone else's point of view and experiences, that to really have a well-rounded idea of what we want for the future.
Yeah, so we're getting close to the end of our show, so I'd like to just quick talk about, like, the takeaways that we might have from this conversation. We started the program by saying, we're going to try and answer this question of, would abolition work? And I think that Megan has been more than gracious today in helping us answer that question, but I also think that it's okay to feel a little bit of righteous indignation at that question. In my interview with Edwin last week, we had asked this question, would abolition really work, and answered it by essentially saying, like, did abolishing British rule for, like, Britain's former colonies work? And if independence from the rule of an illegitimate state power did not bring about whatever outcome you're looking for, stability or economic prosperity or whatever, then was abolishing, like, the British Raj for India, for example, was that bad then? Because, like, India didn't become, like, a fucking utopia afterwards? Like, no, like, abolition doesn't need a proof of concept to justify itself, just as India didn't need proof that it could self-govern in order to justify abolishing the British Raj. Haiti didn't need to prove it could self-govern in order to justify rising up against the French slave state. Like, regardless of how the aftermath of abolishing oppressive state rule turns out, that's not the point. It's an unambiguous question of self-determination and self-defense for oppressed people. So would abolition work is, like, the wrong question to ask, because it assumes that the state is what works, in the same sense that it is asking abolition to prove that it works. But abolitionists start from a whole different assumption, that communities already work, not because they're ruled by the state, but in spite of that fact, right? It's the teacher, not the state, who ensures that children are educated. It is the doctor, not the state, that ensures people get health care, right? It is the farmer and the farm worker who ensures that people have stuff to eat, not the state, right? So abolition promises nothing that it's not already within the faculties of society to do. It only seeks to liberate those faculties from the repressive apparatuses of the state. So in response to the question of, would abolition work, I would say, does the current system work? And if so, for whom? So that's all the time that we have for today's show. That is my main takeaway. Is there any last words or last takeaways that you want to give, Megan?
I think I would just say that whenever there's new ideology about something that seems scary, I think it's always beneficial to take anything with a grain of salt, and also just to understand that no one has the answers, and all we're trying to do is find the best possible outcome for our plan for the future. Yeah.
Dope. Okay, so this has been Abolition Now. We're here every Wednesday, same time, same channel. Next week, we'll have another exciting program lined up for you. We'll be inviting the notorious SQE, Students for Quality Education, into the studio to talk about abolishing campus policing and the community-based alternatives for campus safety that SQE is pushing for and winning across the CSU system. That's going to be one hell of a show, and that will be next week, December 7th at 12 p.m. PST. Again, right here on Otter Media. So as always, if you have questions or comments about today's show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic for us to cover in a future episode, you can reach out to us via email. It's adlc@csumb.edu or on Instagram @adlc.csumb. See you next time.
Don't you know, we're talking about a revolution. It sounds like a whisper. Don't you know, talking about a revolution. It sounds like a whisper. While they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know, talking about a revolution. It sounds people gonna rise up, get their share. Poor people gonna rise up and take what's theirs. Don't you know you better run, 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 run. Oh, I said you better run, 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 run. Finally the tables are starting to turn. Talking about a revolution. Yes, finally the tables are starting to turn. Talking about a revolution. Oh no. Talking about a revolution. Oh, while they're standing in the welfare lines, crying to those of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know, talking about a revolution sounds whisper. And finally the tables are starting to turn. Talking about a revolution. Yes, finally the tables are starting to turn. Talking about a revolution.